Good morning and welcome. My name is Nicole Bibbins-Sedaca. I'm the Executive Vice President of Freedom House, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone here for this important and timely conversation. I want to thank everybody for joining us for the launch of Nations in Transit 2022. This is an annual publication that we do on the state of democracy and human rights in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. We've been publishing it since 1995, and unquestionably, undoubtedly, this is an important year to be focused on this region, as it has been for so many years. For those of you who don't know Freedom House, we are the oldest international pro-democracy organization in America, and we celebrate this year our 9th decade of operations. We were founded in 1941, and we've been since then have been directly supporting defenders of democracy and human rights around the world, advocating for policy change to advance freedom, and conducting rigorous research like this report to highlight the challenges and opportunities for democracy around the world. This year's edition of Nations in Transit is entitled From Democratic Decline to Authoritarian Aggression, and it does come at an incredibly tenuous moment for democracy, human rights, and freedom in the region. I don't have to tell most of you that President Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine is not only a blatant attack on the lives and freedoms of the Ukrainian people, but also on Ukraine's sovereignty. And it's an assault on the basic democratic principles and threat to freedom everywhere. And it's what we're seeing in so many places. And we know if Russia prevails, it will mark the first time that an authoritarian power has overthrown a freely elected national government in the region since the end of the Cold War. And as we have seen the awful consequences of this war, the horrible pictures that have been shocking to all of us, we know that it's just a taste of what the world would look like if we have no checks on such anti-democratic behavior. And even if the Russian invasion fails, we know that there's already been a tremendous impact and a destabilization on the region, and it's likely to give a green light to accelerate some of the anti-democratic trends that have been taking place in Europe and Eurasia. Not only were 2 leading authoritarians recently re-elected, if we look to Viktor Orban in Hungary and Alexander Vučić in Serbia, but also in Armenia, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere, we're seeing an appalling deterioration of democratic principles in the region, and we'll have the opportunity to unpack that. In just a moment, I will hand the virtual platform over to my colleagues, our report director, Mike Smeltzer, and the co-author, Noah Buyon, who will walk us through the report's findings. And I'll just leave to say, it's our job at Freedom House to track these emerging threats and democracy, and to highlight the challenges that we're facing in a world with increasing authoritarianism. But we also need to focus on how we counter them. And we are heartened by the solidarity that we're seeing right now among democracies that have shown that the cause of Ukrainian freedom is essential to the people of Ukraine and to all of us who stand for democracy. But we also know it will take sustained and decisive action to stem this authoritarian tide. There's a lot of work to be done. We've got 2 great and wonderful democracy activists with us as well, in Jamie Fly and Susan Glasser, and we're just delighted that we will have a panel with them right after the findings that Noah and Mike will walk us through. So with that, let me turn over to Mike and Noah, and then I will introduce Jamie and Susan as we turn to the panel. Mike.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicole. Noah's going to bring up the slides for our presentation very quick, and we will get this going. So thank you again to Nicole. Thank you to our panelists for joining, and thank you everyone for attending today's presentation of our findings for Nations in Transit 2022. As Nicole said, Nations in Transit is Freedom House's annual report, which evaluates the state of democracy in the region stretching from Central Europe to Central Asia. And NIT, as we call it, focuses on the institutional factors of democratic resilience. That is, how institutions provide, protect, and support our fundamental freedoms. And so each year we score the 29 countries of this region on 7 indicators that assess the health of those institutions. And based on those scores, we categorize the countries on a range from consolidated democracy to a consolidated authoritarian regime. Before we get to our findings, though, I have to say a huge thank you to USAID for their continued support of this important project. And thank you to all of our country experts, without whom this report would not be possible. So this year's report, titled From Democratic Decline to Authoritarian Aggression, documents the 18th year in a row of democratic decline in the nation's in transit region. And this predates the 16-year global democratic decline that we've seen in our work in Freedom in the World. For years now, authoritarians have been on the offensive, while liberal democratic practices have been increasingly discarded. Domestically, demagogues and dictators run roughshod over the rule of law and the separation of powers. Elections are seldom fair, even when they are nominally free. Governments regard the freedoms of assembly, association, expression as inconveniences, if not outright threats to their continued rule. And judicial independence, which has been long warped by endemic corruption, is faltering in the face of abusive lawmaking. And looking internationally at the relations between states, conflict, coercion, attacks on the legitimacy of key principles and institutions have proliferated at the expense of good faith dialogue and the search for common interests. It's these disturbing trends, which are present to varying degrees everywhere in this region, that are shaping the contours of a new, more violent and less democratic phase of history. And indeed, liberal democracy is no longer the presumed form of governance or political development in this region. Rather, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia are headed in two distinct directions. One, the abyss of full-blown autocracy, and two, the gray zone of hybrid governance. Now, Noah will dive deeper into hybrid regimes in this report, but I think it's important to just say really quickly what we mean when we call a country a hybrid regime. In short, hybrid regimes combine elements of both autocratic and democratic governance. And as this graphic shows here, for the first time since the start of this 18-year modern democratic decline in the region, the predominant form of governance, in fact, is now this hybrid regime. But let's talk about the autocracies first, because I feel like that's a little bit easier to understand in this current moment. Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, these absolutely horrific abuses and atrocities being committed by the Russian forces have really opened the eyes of democracy's defenders to the threat posed to freedom and democracy by unconstrained dictatorship. Entrenched leaders across the region have rejected liberal democracy and embraced personalist forms of authoritarian rule, that is, in which the state's power is concentrated in the hands of an individual. These autocrats have also intensified their domestic repression, viewing any and all dissent as a threat to their power. And increasingly, we're seeing them turn their sights outside their own borders. Very briefly, I'd like to show you the scores of the 8 consolidated autocratic regimes. As you can see, all of these countries are nearing the bottom of this report scale, with Turkmenistan already receiving the lowest possible score. And yet, in many of these countries, even as their scores can go no lower, real-world conditions have continued to grow worse and will likely continue to grow worse. Personalism is, which I mentioned, is expanding. Across this set of autocratic countries, leaders continue to hold on to the reins of power, in some cases for more than 2 decades. Emomali Rakhmon of Tajikistan, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, and Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan have all remained at the top for more than 18 years. And this growing trend of personalism can be seen, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, the most recent country to fall into the category of consolidated authoritarian regimes. In 2021, Sadir Japarov manipulated voters and rigged a referendum process to overhaul the constitution and reinstitute a presidentialist model that grants him vast influence over the state and could see his continued rule for many years to come. And as strongman rule has dominated in these autocratic regimes, these figures have sought to wipe out the institutions meant to provide crucial checks on the arbitrary and abusive use of their executive power. Russia provides a rather stark example of this in the last year, as Putin and his allies have gone after basically every remaining form of real and perceived dissent, from the arrest of Alexei Navalny at the beginning of the year to the closure of Memorial, Russia's oldest human rights organization, at the end of the year. 2021 was just a year of monumental repression in Russia. And this graphic here shows the dramatic increase in the use of the so-called foreign agents legislation to target independent media outlets and civic organizations, as well as individual journalists. And repression in Russia has only increased and intensified as Putin has unleashed his war on Ukraine. And now I'd like to turn it to Noah to talk about what's happening with hybrid regimes and democracies in this region.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks everyone for being with us. I'm now going to take us through a little tour of the hybrid regime category, which, as Mike mentioned, is now the largest category in our survey. The number of hybrid regimes has almost tripled from 4 to 11 over the past 18 years. To just expand briefly on what Mike mentioned earlier, it might be useful to think of hybrid regimes as countries where democratic institutions are paired with authoritarian practices. To give an illustrative example, we might expect in an authoritarian regime that an independent media outlet would be shuttered or censored altogether, whereas in a hybrid regime, it would merely be bought up by a pro-regime oligarch. Now, let's take a look at the scores. The blue bars you see here represent the current democracy scores of the hybrid regimes. The orange dots represent where these countries started 18 years ago. Hybrid regimes in our survey are those that fall within this 3 to 4 score band. I would imagine that Hungary stands out the most on this chart. As you can see, its decline from 2004 to 2021 has been precipitous. Over the past 18 years, and especially in the last 12, since incumbent Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been in power, it's fallen from a consolidated democracy to a hybrid regime, the only country to have made that journey in our survey. Its trajectory is unique, but Orban's model of, quote, illiberal democracy has spread to Poland, to Slovenia, and beyond, and I'll talk a little bit about that down the line. Now, the most essential observation about hybrid regimes is that countries entering this category, what we call the gray zone of hybrid governance, are stuck there. This chart, I think, illustrates very clearly the kind of gravitational pull or stickiness exerted by this category. As you can see, 4 democracies have fallen into this category over the past 18 years, but 3 authoritarian regimes have risen up and also come to rest in this category. I think that offers something of a silver lining. It's no mean feat that Armenia, Kosovo, Moldova, and indeed countries like Georgia and Ukraine have not fallen prey to recrudescent authoritarianism and remain in this gray zone. Nevertheless, this is a problem because we know that there's a better alternative to hybrid governance out there. It's liberal democracy. So the important question is, how do countries escape the gray zone? We believe that the best way is through elections. This is because elections are the only way. Other options, revolution or regime change, just aren't viable. Now, crucially, all hybrid regimes hold elections. These are not necessarily free or fair elections, but they are competitive. To use an uncharacteristic sports analogy, you could analogize competing against an incumbent in a hybrid regime to playing against the 1992 Dream Team in the Olympics. You're going to lose almost certainly, but it's still a basketball game. So, as a matter of fact, a number of opposition figures in hybrid regimes have won in recent years. And in this chart, I've spotlighted 6 different elections, the year of which is represented by the red dots you see, in which the opposition has experienced breakthroughs. But they're able to do this through a number of strategies, most notably unifying with other opposition camps to prevent incumbents from splitting the vote. But I hope what you can see here is that even after these breakthroughs occur, it's pretty unusual for meaningful reforms to take place. In other words, winning an election is just the first step. I talk in much more detail about why this is the case in one of the essays we wrote for this edition, and I encourage you all to check it out on our website. But in the interest of time, I'd like to turn to the countries at the top of our rankings, the democracies, where all is not well. Even among the comparatively strong democracies of Central Eastern Europe, there's no immunity to the 18-year democratic decline, which we've observed. So once again, a little tour through the scores. I'd like to highlight 2 things. As you can see, Poland's score has fallen furthest. I mentioned that Poland is kind of hot on Hungary's heels when it comes to, quote, democratic backsliding. And the rest of the countries seem like they haven't moved very much. But one thing I'd like to stress is that there are no countries in the highest possible score band in our survey, between the numbers 7 and 6. This means that there are no more exemplars in the region of the best practices of liberal democracy. I think citizens are getting keyed into this because, as this chart shows, people among the best performers in the Nations in Transit survey are not happy with the way that democracy is working for them. In 7 out of the 10 top performers in the survey, a majority of citizens think that democracy is broken. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that in 8 of these 10, Freedom House documented sort of democratic declines over the past year, with the 2 exceptions being Bulgaria and Croatia, both of which we rate as only semi-consolidated democracies. Why is this happening? I'd like to spotlight 2 trends driving the democratic decline, although of course other sort of forces are at play. The first is corruption, which is an endemic issue, a long unaddressed issue. And as you can see on this chart, represented by the blue dot on the corruption indicator, it is the lowest, it is sort of the worst defect of democracies on average in our survey. The other trend I want to highlight is illiberalism, which is an ideology that sort of rejects the necessity of independent checks on rule and rejects the idea of legitimate disagreement in the public sphere. And as serious an ideological challenge as it is, it's often used as a cover for mere venality or corruption. This is an accelerating force across the region, emanating in some respects from Budapest, Viktor Orban's Hungary, but it could be seen in the last year, for instance, in Poland, where the government used politically captured judges to reject human rights guarantees in the foundational treaties of the European Union. You could also see it in Slovenia, where Prime Minister Janez Janša used the bully pulpit, that is his Twitter account, to berate critics or perceived critics in the media, in the judiciary, in the parliament, and so on and so forth, betraying an illiberal intolerance of any and all criticism. Now, I'll turn it back to Mike to round us out.
Thank you, Noah. So before we turn to the panel, we just have one last question of what can be done. We have to be able to do something to stem the spread of authoritarianism and to defend and strengthen fundamental freedoms. And we have a list of recommendations in our report as well as on the website. But I think it's important to note that these solutions need not only states, but also civil society and the private sector. And so we've broken these recommendations down into 2 large buckets. 1, restricting the ability of authoritarians to co-opt the liberal international order, and 2, supporting democracy and its defenders. So restricting the ability of authoritarians, this involves things like addressing the financial crime loopholes that authoritarians often exploit, or applying targeted sanctions as part of a comprehensive foreign policy, while of course minimizing the impacts on civilians and human rights defenders in those countries. Supporting democracy and its defenders, there are a number of things that we can do in supporting pro-democracy actors, civil society groups, and human rights defenders. This, of course, includes addressing democratic deficiencies at home, and prioritizing democracy in the EU accession process and integration. We would like to see this process really advance in the NIT region, because really the struggle for democracy in this region, it has global implications, and we have to seize this pivotal moment to undertake creative, multilateral, and sustained policy solutions in the face of these really extraordinary challenges that are happening right now. So with that, thank you so much for listening to us and for your interest in our report. You are welcome to reach out to us if you have any further questions. You can read the report online. And now I'll turn it back to Nicole to get this panel started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike and Noah. I'm going to ask our team to pull up my video. We are just having a few technical difficulties. Thank you so much. It was an extraordinary overview of what is going on in a very complex region. It is a delight now to turn to a panel that will be able to help us maybe not make sense of all of it, but certainly be able to give our listeners a context for what they are seeing and further analysis to the great report that Mike and Noah produced. So we're really delighted that we are joined by Susan Glasser, who is a prominent journalist and obviously just by her profession is a deep and crucial part of what democracy looks like. She's a staff writer at the New Yorker and a CNN Global Affairs analyst. We're also joined by Jamie Fly, who is the president and CEO of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and obviously doing a tremendous amount of work in this region to provide access to information and to provide and support many human rights defenders and journalists in the area. And obviously we will have Mike stay on with us to also answer questions. So Susan, let me start with you. Obviously, we just heard from Mike and Noah about the decline in the region. And in 2005, you wrote a book that about a number of different topics in this region, but certainly specifically about the rise of Vladimir Putin. And you named the subtitle of your book, The End of Revolution. And you argue that Putin saw his task not about completing the transition to democracy, but about rolling it back, that was a main focus of his. Do you think that he has fulfilled that mission? Is there hope that this democratic revolution can continue or be regained some momentum while he continues to rule?
Well, thank you, first of all, Nicole, for this, and thank you to everyone. The report is an invaluable tool, and tracking this over time, as we see, has a certain kind of awful power to it, doesn't it? It's. I remember, I think, when I was editor of Foreign Policy, moderating like the rollout of the global democracy report. Maybe it was after only 10 years of rollback of democracy. And so here we are. I did write a book about Putin in 2005 with my husband, Peter Baker. We arrived in Moscow in basically the very beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure as correspondents in Moscow. And there was a lot of existential debates at the time in Washington as well as in European capitals about, what did Putin represent? And there was still a view, obviously quite discredited now, but widely held, including at the senior levels of the US government, that Vladimir Putin was actually going to be a sort of Western-oriented modernizer, if not a big Democrat, then at least one who had no vision of altering the system. And, that was, I think, I say that only because right now, I think we're in a similar period of fog around something that's relatively clear. No, the answer in short is that it is not possible to imagine, as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in Russia, any return. And in fact, quite the opposite. What I've been struck by is how behind again and again and again we are. And now we see this catastrophe in Ukraine. And I think the thing I would like to say to everybody who's, tracking this and listening to this today, people who care deeply about the region, the domestic repression that this report documents so powerfully, the increasing personalization, as you put it, I think correctly, of the Russian regime and those in the surrounding satellite areas is not a surprise. It is, in fact, something that people should have been shouting from the rooftops about for the last few years. And it is a direct outcome that we're now seeing of that shift in the nature of the regime, that there are no pressure points on Vladimir Putin. You can see the wrongheadedness informing US and Western policy, at least at the beginning of this Ukraine war. Well, we'll sanction the oligarchs. Well, if Vladimir Putin doesn't listen to them, that's not exactly going to be a deterrent, is it? We'll put out information to discredit the security services. Well, if they're already either not providing Putin with accurate information or they were the ones resisting it, then that's not going to be a very effective policy either. And I worry that we are not well equipped the power of a report like this is in its naming and its categories, and it's helping to clarify and sharpen thinking. And that's why I really appreciate, this rubric of personalization, because I think that requires an entirely different way of analyzing Russia and China and other countries that would fall into this category, an entirely different way, therefore, of responding to their actions. And you talked in the beginning here, which I think is very helpful, about some of the actions that we've seen inside of Russia, things like eliminating Memorial, the final human rights, the sort of architect of a return of history to Russia at the end of the Cold War, now gone. The imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, which was a very important step. And now, of course, all the crackdowns that we've seen, extreme levels. Many people that I speak with really don't understand how extreme Putin's regime is, even relative to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. And that would be one thing I would throw out there for Freedom House to think about moving forward, is to what extent is it possible perhaps to introduce new categories or analytical framework that deepen our understanding, unfortunately, of these extreme authoritarian regimes. So I was really struck in the presentation, and I'll leave it at that, that countries that are already at the bottom of the category, whether that's Russia or Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, we probably need to fill in our understanding of what they're doing there, rather than just saying year in and year out, well, they're not moving at all. You know what I mean? And so I would really suggest, like, as an analyst, as someone who's struggling with this very alarming set of developments, I'm often trying to compare it to the Soviet Union or other 20th century extreme authoritarian or totalitarian models. And I would like to know, how does this really compare with that? For example, a sentence of 15 years for calling a war in Russia. If you don't call it a special military operation, that's the maximum sentence. So far, as I understand it, they haven't necessarily been handing out that sentence, but they could. As I think about that, remember that the sentences that were given to the Gulag, if they didn't kill you right away, were about that length or somewhat shorter. And so I think that gives you a sense of perspective here. And I'll leave it at that. But I'm deeply grateful for all the work that you do. And I did find this to be an extremely helpful presentation and starting to think about where we go from here.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Susan. And that is a great next area for us to continue to dig into, because I think we really do need to continue to unpack what is going on. And I think your point also about none of us should be surprised about authoritarian aggression overseas. It is always married to long histories of repression at home. And Putin has been doing that in many, many places within his own country and also in places like Syria. Jamie, let me turn to you. Mike and Noah outlined shocking increase in the use of foreign agent laws and other tools against organizations in Russia, including independent media outlets and journalists. From your perspective at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, how has the environment for independent journalism in autocratic countries in this region changed in recent years? And how does that impact the work that you're doing and adapting to the challenges that you see in these countries?
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for having me. And I also just want to commend Freedom House for the report, which, as I read it, I found myself nodding my head because we operate in most of the countries covered in the report. And our experience as an institution, the experience of our journalists, I think is reflected in the disturbing picture that's painted here. And I would just pick up on a couple of things Susan raised. I completely agree. I think we need to emphasize that domestic repression does not remain domestic in perpetuity. I think we've seen that story play out time and time again. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is just the latest example of that, but that's a fundamental challenge that I think many in not just this administration, but in US governments in general, within European Union governments, they still struggle with that notion. There's still a sense that we have strategic interests that mean that we need to work with some of these countries, that we're going to lay off of them when it comes to media freedom or corruption or whatever the other challenges to democratic institutions. And so I think far too many democratic governments are often cautious about actually prioritizing these issues and confronting some of these either backsliding democracies or the hybrid regimes which were outlined, let alone the authoritarian regimes, where even there, I think too many governments are often too silent. And we've seen this story play out. I would just use Russia as an example of that, where I think our own history over the last 31 years has been very disturbing. We were actually even going back before we were invited in 1991 by Boris Yeltsin. And just to kind of foot stomp Susan's point, at the end of the Cold War, according to the histories I've read, most notably by Arch Puddington from Freedom House, who wrote one of the definitive histories of RFERL, it was safer for our journalists to operate inside the Soviet Union probably in 1987, 1988 than it is today in Putin's Russia. And so the level of backsliding even goes beyond what we were seeing at the end of the Soviet era. We had more than 100 freelancers reportedly working in Russia at that point. Our number now is dwindling just because of the risks, because of the legal threats, the criminal threats that Susan highlighted. Many of our journalists have had to flee since the war began. We already started moving people out of Russia last year. We have been a foreign agent now for more than 5 years. We were essentially the first media outlet designated as a foreign agent inside Russia. And slowly over time, Vladimir Putin has blocked each avenue of access to the Russian public by us, and now to a wide swath of independent media. And initially, I think the response in many in the international community was to look at that and say, well, you're a US funded media organization, so sure, the Russians may want to put some additional restrictions on you. But we always warned that it would not end with us, that we were just the first step of a larger strategy of eventually reaching ultimate information control of the Russian public. And that's what we see today with the outright blocking of websites, the criminalization of journalism, to the extent that people now are scared to speak on the record. They're scared to give interviews. They're scared to share information with journalists. And to access independent content, you need to pursue technological means using a VPN or some other circumvention technology to even be aware of what's going on in the outside world and to get factual information, not just about the war, but now about a wide range of political topics. And that transformation has happened over many decades, but it really sped up here in the final years. And it's an extreme situation that allows Vladimir Putin to obviously stay in power and make it easier for him to maintain his control on power, but also then to do certain things abroad, which have far-reaching consequences, certainly for Ukraine, but also for international security. And so I think it should be a reminder about the dangers when we allow authoritarians or authoritarian-minded leaders to pursue these tactics. The final thing I'll just note initially is that unfortunately, Russia plays an outsized role in this region that the report is highlighting. We see this across places like Central Asia, where Russian tactics are often modeled by other regimes. And so even the foreign agent terminology, the use of foreign agent laws, after the Russians really began to use these tactics against media organizations, including us, we saw many other proposals across markets that we operate in to do the same thing, to mirror Russian legislation. And so I think that's not just a problem in the media space, but in all the other areas, whether it's corruption, whether it's attempts to weaken and control the judiciary. Russia has played a powerful role in spreading these tactics and modeling these tactics for use by other authoritarians to preserve their grip on power. And that's something that also needs additional attention and needs to be condemned early on by democratic governments who care about preserving and advancing democracy in the region.
That's an excellent point, Jamie. Thank you for really pinning that one, because I do think we really need to figure out how we mobilize far more action and recognize that we can't wait until it gets to the point of the escalation that we're seeing now. No one is surprised by Putin's action, and the impact is, as you're saying, not just Ukraine by any means. It is really that wider impact and how other authoritarians are emboldened by this. You know, Mike, let me pick up on that point that Jamie's making and ask, obviously this report looks at the last year, and we have to also look forward and think about what we can do. Are there positive, are there positive things that we need to be looking at, opportunities that exist as the world galvanizes and wakes up a bit to what we're seeing with the attack on Ukraine? Or are we in for a longer term of sort of democracy's star dimming in this region? How would you see that?
Yeah, it's a tough question to ask at this point, because we're so early into this war. I mean, I think many of us who follow this closely think it's not going to end anytime soon. Russia is, getting ready to push harder in the Eastern Donbass. And one thing that working on NIT that we've documented for years is the impact on crises and the way they bubble out, these second order consequences of a localized crisis having an impact on democracy throughout the region. So you can think about the 08-09 global financial crisis. You can think about the 2010 European debt crisis. You can think about the 2015 migration crisis. All of these have had negative impacts on democracy in the region.
Right.
And now there's a war. There's a war in Europe that is going to have an impact, even if in the short term, democracies are kind of closing ranks and helping Ukraine. This will have long-term implications for the region. And I really appreciate Jimmy bringing up Central Asia, because I feel like not much attention is being paid to what the impacts of this will be for the people of Central Asia. They, as Jamie said, Russia has an outsized impact on what happens in Central Asia. And as a result of Russia's unilateral actions to invade a sovereign democratic Ukraine, the democracies of the world have rightly sanctioned the Russian regime. That is having implication and impact on Central Asia. We see that Russia has halted all wheat exports to Central Asia. Kazakhstan has then followed suit to halt all wheat exports to the other countries of Central Asia. Remittances, people working in Russia that send money back to Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, they are all declining. And what is this going to do in these countries that, as Susan said, they can't go any lower on our scale? Nevertheless, things are going to get worse. How do we understand what is going to happen? There is not a lot of not a short-term bright future for many of these places. However, there are some bright spots that I think are worth identifying in this region. I think there are pathways out. Some of the things that we identified this year was the resilience and flexibility of civil society and individual human rights defenders. Mm-hmm. This is one thing we wrote an essay on, which is that depending on the type of regime that one might find oneself in, civil society takes on different roles. If it's in a democracy, it helps to kind of support and bolster the democratic efforts of a democratic government. If it's in an autocratic regime, they are an insurgent civil society. That is, they are working to prevent further autocratization and to try and move towards democracy. And so we see this flexibility of civil society in all of these places. Civil society people are adaptable. They will find solutions to help democracy, because it's clear that democracy still has some appeal. One other thing, which I think is closely connected to civil society, is local governance. That was the one indicator on average that improved in 2021 as a result of people coming out and saying, okay, we see that there's power being consolidated at the national level. Let's do something in our municipalities, in our cities, in our regions. So you have countries like Ukraine. Unfortunately, their democratic progress is being wiped out, but they came together and worked on participatory budgeting, where local people were getting involved in the budgets of their local communities. Or you have places like Croatia, where local reformers came to power and pushed accountability and transparency in local municipalities. And this has a great effect on kind of showing people that democracy can still play a role, even if it's on a local level. But that helps them work up to the national level, right? So there are pathways to democratization in this region, but it requires people. I mean, it's going to require everybody. This requires people power. And unfortunately, as we've seen with this dissatisfaction of democracy increasing, we need to find ways to make it appealing again and to get people involved. That's what this is really going to take.
That's an excellent point, and that's it's a wake-up call for democratic governance, for foundations, for organizations to really think about how are we supporting those human rights defenders, local leaders that are really on the front lines of a lot of this change. Susan, let me come back to you and ask, one of the troubling trends in the report are these continued backsliding in once democratic governments like Hungary and Serbia. What do you think the victories of Viktor Orban and Alexander Vučić mean for democracy in the EU and then just broader in the Europe-Eurasia region?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the way that Jamie very importantly pointed out that, crackdowns on places like RFE are the early warning signs of, further efforts, that unchecked, we know what direction authoritarians go in, should be extremely worrisome, not only to the EU and the prospects for democracy in the sort of fault line of Europe as it hits Russia's world, but also for us. I mean, I think that it's a cautionary tale for the United States as well. And, one of the things I'm in fact really struck by, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of Russia's war and, Washington's response to it, the difference in some ways between now and the Cold War. And again, I recognize that's a broad brush, but is this idea that it's not just authoritarians versus democracies, which has been the frame that you've seen President Biden try to put on it from the beginning of his tenure, but that we're having a situation where the democracies are both opposing autocracies and also have significant and growing populations within that are even openly supportive of Vladimir Putin. I mean, let's be real. This is not, it's not a contest where we're united, but in fact, where we're divided. And, Hungary, it strikes me, is a ticking time bomb within the European Union. And you cannot have a long-term viable situation where major countries inside, or major blocks potentially of countries inside a union that calls itself a democratic one, who do not subscribe to its principles. And the EU never envisioned that. One of the things that Putin, I think, has been so successful in showing the way and creating a new playbook for others around the region is profiting off of our lack of imagination and our inability and the weaknesses built into our institutions. And one of the great weaknesses of the EU is that it actually has no mechanisms for dealing with democratic backsliding among its members because it didn't think that was a possibility. And of course, we've seen here in the United States our own institutional weaknesses and things that were not laws but turned out to be norms that were easily shattered. We've seen those used against democracy inside the United States. And so that's the one other thing I would sort of flag here and to underscore. I love, Jamie, your phrase of foot stomping the point. I'm going to steal that in the future because that's a great image that you left us with. But to foot stomp the point here, Russia's influence as a malign actor and as a creator of a new playbook should not be understated. It strikes me as a dominant model in this region and a very explicit goal of Putin's both domestic and foreign policy. In fact, you saw him say in this, sort of fascinating dunk the football interview with Lionel Barber of the FT a few years ago, essentially saying the era of liberal democracy is over and we won. We won. The bad guys won. And he has created a playbook. He has created a notion of common cause. I think it's often mischaracterized as a resurrection of the Soviet Union. I think it's has much more ideologically in common with late Tsarist era orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism was the motto of the Romanovs before they were toppled. To me, that's a much better fit with Putin, and it's a better fit with Viktor Orban and with Donald Trump. And so I think, you know, again, these events do not occur in isolation from one another. And that's one other challenge I would sort of leave everybody with in terms of tracking the trajectory of individual countries. It can be easy to lose or not to really be able to account for the fact that these things are happening in so many different countries at the same moment in time is obviously not a coincidence. And how do we analytically account for that?
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Jamie, let me just go to you briefly before we open up for questions. So if people who are viewing and listening, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can before the top of the hour. Jamie, as an organization that is working so closely with so many different journalists and other activists in this region, what do you see as the opportunities for support for those individuals who are really, you know, the hands and feet of democracy in this area?
Well, I think first, picking up on what Susan was talking about, democracies, the EU, the United States, they need to take a stand, especially against the hybrid regimes, which are acting as if they have all the trappings of democracy, and they need to hold those governments accountable when they are trying to speak in the language of democracy, yet they, on the side, control half of the country's media because they realize it gives them a political advantage. We need to call them out on that. And the EU in particular, or certainly if it's an EU member, should be more stringent with its requirements. It should make this more of an important part of the process for new members. And so that's one thing. In our cases, we always ask for more vocal advocacy for journalists under pressure. We have 4 of our colleagues in prison right now. We ask governments to speak out on their behalf. And I've seen even the worst authoritarian regimes care about criticism. I've seen this from many of the Central Asian states where we have major challenges where our journalists are constantly being harassed and pressured and denied accreditation. They respond when governments take a stand and speak out, when parliamentarians send them letters. They care about that criticism, and it often can change their policy. Journalists need more legal assistance. They need visas to find safe havens when they get kicked out of places like Russia. They need safe locations to work from. And then perhaps most importantly, we need more conversation about how to ensure a viable funding model for journalism in many of these countries. There are international public broadcasters like RFERL that can play an important role, but we cannot be the only part of that media ecosystem. And media at the local level in particular is struggling across this region, just like it is in the United States and in Europe. And we still, I don't think anywhere in the world have found a viable funding model to ensure that news organizations can stay alive in the digital era. But we need that sort of funding model, because if you don't have a diverse set of media options for people, that void will be filled either by the governments themselves with state-sponsored propaganda or by government-friendly oligarchs. And we see the story play out time and time again across this region. And so some sort of funding model for independent journalism is essential, I think, to helping ensure democratic progress in the region.
Excellent, excellent. That is a great list of to-dos, both for democratic governments as well as all of us in the democracy community. We have one question that's come in, Mike, that maybe I can throw to you about corruption specifically. You mentioned it in your overview. If you could go into a little bit more depth on the extent of the problem, but also to share what can be done to choke off what is basically corruption as the funding source of many of these authoritarian governments.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as Noah said, the corruption is both a problem in democracies as well as autocracies. And it's, we see the way that it has continued to fund and prop up some of these autocratic regimes, like Russia's a great example of it. They have abused, we talked about how the ways that they abuse the international global order, the global democratic order that has let them, hide their money in Western democracies. Because obviously they can't hide it in their own, because there's the risk that it will be stolen by somebody higher up the food chain in many of these autocratic countries. And so right now we're seeing, as Susan said, we're trying to sanction oligarchs and go after these corrupt individuals. But really what we need to be doing is making sure that our democratic fundamentals when it comes to the international financial system work in a way that helps everybody. And that means closing off the offshore bank accounts and closing off the loopholes that exist not only in Europe, but here as well in America. I mean, there's plenty that we can do, and we have lots of recommendations of this on our website. I highly recommend everybody go look at the recommendations that we have, because there are specific policies that we can do, but also it's a moment to think about what the future is going to look like. I think one of the things that I've seen, and I think I can sense it kind of in Susan and Jamie's responses, is that there is a sort of democratic complacency right now. We all have this sort of triumphalism that we're all helping Ukraine. But what really needs to be done is not a return to sort of this idealized version of the 80s and 90s when everybody was coming out of communism, but really something new, big like structural changes to the way that the international system works, founded on protection of our fundamental freedoms and democracy. And so there are a whole host of things that we need to do, but it's going to require many people, economists, who I am not one, coming together and thinking about how do we build these systems to make sure that this doesn't happen going forward. So I think, there's lots that can be done at this time.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me send this question to you, Susan, which is, an interesting bit in the presentation was about this growing dissatisfaction with democracy, even in those countries that are strong democracies that are doing well, although facing many challenges like many long-standing democracies. What do you think is driving this dissatisfaction, or what can we take away from that as a way to possibly reverse that trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of the essence of the moment, especially as we're having that conversation, here in the United States and in, many democracies in Western Europe. Look at the election that's happening right now between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. I think, again, that's what's so striking to me about the moment, is that it's not like, well, here's two teams and, we'll just go at it in a war of ideas. This is something that exists within our society as well as external to it. And, one question I have as I think about this index and these findings is, how much of an earthquake will Russia's war in Ukraine actually prove to be in the initial phases after the invasion? Right, there was a sense that this was really going to reorder European security, but also kind of European politics around that security, that we would have essentially a consolidation, perhaps a renewal of faith in democracy and unity to face in a more united and a more concerted and a more purposeful way an external threat. You would think the same thing would happen here, right? Like, what could be more clarifying, than, people being ripped out of their homes as they, aspire to join modern European democracy. And, look at the stakes there. And here we are, beating each other to pieces over a face mask, right? You would think that the sort of folly of our own politics here or in Western Europe would be clarified by this moment. But of course, that's obviously not happening. And so I think that's very worrisome. One question that a lot of people often resort to is the issue of structural economic challenges that are somehow fueling this discontent. Or they talk about the media and the ability to live in alternate realities or to be vulnerable to extreme disinformation. My sense is it's all of the above, but getting our own houses in order, unfortunately, seems like it's the real challenge when confronting something like Putin's Russia.
Yeah. Excellent point. Jamie, in our last remaining 2 minutes, let me throw one question to you. There's a question in the chat about what's going to be most effective, of whether that point of international pressure or encouraging grassroots movements. You are a person who has worked and looked at it from many different angles. So where do you come out on that, that either or question?
I think it needs to be both. I think the challenge, though, and I think the report documents this as well, is you can't just have grassroots movements that topple a government, because you don't know what will follow, especially if there aren't institutional guardrails. And we've seen this in multiple places across the region. I think Kyrgyzstan is highlighted in the report. It's a perfect example where there was a public uprising, partly out of frustration with the corruption that was endemic in the Kyrgyz government. But now the resulting government has made some very controversial decisions that could take Kyrgyzstan to a very concerning place when it comes to its future protections of civil liberties. So that's the challenge. You can't just have change for change's sake. It needs also to go hand in hand with that sort of support from democratic governments that can provide the training, the assistance to actually help those that take over power to do the right thing and to not take their countries backwards. And so I think both need to work together.
Excellent. That is a great call to action to end on. Let me just thank Susan and Jamie for joining us today. Just really wonderful to have your expertise on this panel, really giving additional voice to this report. Thank you to Mike and Noah for an extraordinary report. And I hope that everyone listening is able to take a look at the recommendations and the analysis that's in the report that we got just a little taste of. You know, I think we had a lot of hard-hitting news coming out of this and out of this discussion, out of this report, but I think there's also an important takeaway that this is a call to action and really an opportunity and a necessity for democratic governments, for journalists, for independent organizations, for foundations to get in the game on this work to really push back on the trends and the dynamics that we're seeing in this region. So thank you to all who've joined. Thank you to Susan and Jamie. Thank you, Mike and Noah, for an excellent report. And we look forward to working with people on this important region going forward. Take care.
Thank you.